Stories in Aesop fables have happy endings. Russian tales rarely have happy endings. My guest found out the hard way. His story is one of riches, robbery, revenge, and redressal in Red Russia. Joining me today on RD360 is Bill Browder. He is the CEO and founder of Hermitage Capital and currently, because of troubles in Russia, also a human rights activist. Bill, thank you and welcome to RD360.
Thank you.
Bill, someone once wrote about you that you lived 3 lives. Let me start with your first life. Your family in America were communists and you wanted to become a capitalist. Why?
So my grandfather was an American from Kansas, a labor union organizer, and he was invited to Russia in 1927 by the Communist Party. And he got there, he married my grandmother. My father was born in Moscow. And then he returned to America and became the general secretary of the American Communist Party, running for president twice against Roosevelt on the communist ticket. He was eventually persecuted. He was kicked out of the Communist Party by Stalin for being too capitalist, and then he was persecuted by McCarthy for being too communist.
In the 1950s in America.
So I was born in 1964. I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, and I thought, what's the best way of rebelling from a family of communists? And for me, it was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And so that's what I set out to do. And I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down.
Absolutely.
And I looked at the situation, and I said to myself, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe, and that's what I set out to do.
What piqued your interest in Eastern Europe and the privatization program there? Was there a flashpoint?
So my first job out of business school was with the Boston Consulting Group in London. And one day they came to me and said, we have an assignment in Poland, in a little town about 6 hours from Warsaw on the Ukrainian border. And I raised my hand and I jumped at the opportunity. I went to Poland. I sat in this little town. It was a terrible lifestyle. There was food shortages and hyperinflation and all sorts of other stuff. But while I was there, I discovered the very first Polish privatizations being advertised in the newspaper. And I did the math. And they were selling companies at 1/2 of 1 year's earnings. So the value of the company was half the previous year's earnings. So I looked at this and I said to myself, you don't have to go to Stanford Business School to know that a company selling at a PE ratio of 1/2 is a good deal. And so at the time, I had a total of $2,000 of life savings, and I took my $2,000, I bought shares in the privatization, and then they went up 10 times.
And so that brought you to Russia?
So I then became an investor and eventually found myself at Salomon Brothers. And I was at Salomon Brothers at the very beginning of the Russian privatization program. And my first trip to Russia, I went up to a town called Murmansk, which is located a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, to advise a fishing fleet, the management of a fishing fleet on their privatization. So I go to the fishing fleet, and the manager takes me to one of the boats, and it's an enormous big fishing vessel. And I said, how much did this thing cost? He said, about $20 million. And I said, how many of them do you have? And he said, we have about 100. So I said, okay, $2 billion worth of ships. And I said, how old is the fleet? And he said, about 7 years old. So I said, okay, maybe it's about $1 billion worth of ships at market value. And I said, so, and what is your question for me? And he said, the question is, should the management buy 51% of the fleet for $2.5 million?
Holy Toledo.
So there I was. I said, so $5 million to buy a company with $1 billion worth of ships. And I said to myself, I want to have some part of this. And at that point, I went to Moscow just to see if this was an anomaly or whether this was going on across the country.
And Russia just launched its voucher program?
So
explain that to us.
So what happened was they gave a voucher to every person. And so there were 150 million people, 150 million vouchers. The vouchers were freely exchangeable. You could buy and sell them.
And no restrictions.
No restrictions.
Foreigners could buy them.
Foreigners, locals, everything. And the vouchers traded on an exchange, but they traded for roughly $20 each. So if you did the math, 150 million vouchers times 20 gets you $3 billion. $3 billion was exchangeable for 30% of all the shares of all Russian companies, which meant that the market capitalization of Russia at this time, which was, I guess, 1992, was $10 billion. The whole country. 35% of the world's oil, 35% of the world's gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, et cetera, et cetera.
Fertilizers, steel, tractors, real estate.
$10 billion, the whole thing. This was like, you know, a minor, mid-sized oil company in America, the whole country of Russia. And so on the back of that, I decided to set up my company, Hermitage Capital Management, and to invest funds from the West in the Russians.
Did you have any self-doubt, though? I mean, no one was listening to your story at first, and Russia, even at that time, was, you know, the Wild West, in a manner of speaking. Did you suffer self-doubt?
Well, so the answer is that it was pure economic calculation. So if you're buying stuff at a 99.7% discount,
what can happen?
Well, it could go down to a 100% discount, or alternatively, it can get slightly better from horrible, and it can go to a 95% discount, and then you've made many multiples on your money. And I just did the simple math for myself, and I said, let's say that there's a 50% chance that they decide to just change the whole program and go back to communism, and a 50% chance that they don't. So there's a 50% chance of making 10 or 15 times your money, and a 50% chance of losing everything. I'm ready to take that bet. It wasn't a question of confidence versus doubt. It was purely a question of economics.
And Anthony Chubais was the Russian privatization minister, wasn't he?
So Anatoly Chubais was the privatization minister, and he was this ideologue guy who said, let's just give everything away for free.
Because we'll never go back to the old system again, as I remember him saying.
That was the logic. Now, it was faulty logic because because it didn't help create capitalists. It helped create 22 guys became owners of 40% of the country. Oligarchs, the 22 Russian oligarchs, and everyone else lived in abject poverty. And so it wasn't a fair system.
But you were happy. In the initial years, you and the Russian government were friends.
So in the very first years, I had nothing to do with the Russian government. I just bought the shares, did my, typed my spreadsheets, did my analysis. The shares went up. It was only after the collapse and default of 1998 that the Russian oligarchs then started to steal from all the minority shareholders. They were organizing asset stripping and transfer pricing, dilutions, embezzlement, etc. And at that point, I had to start fighting the oligarchs. And at the point that I started fighting the oligarchs it was just the moment when Putin showed up on the scene. And Putin had the same enemies as I did. And I've never met Putin. I'm not his friend. But there's an expression that your enemy's enemy is your friend.
Right, yes.
And so I was going after the oligarchs. So the oligarchs were stealing money from me. They were stealing power from Putin. And so every time I would publicize a scandal about how these guys were stealing from me, he would step in. And so for about 4 years, I had this blessed life where I would do research into how the oligarchs were stealing. I would publicize it. Putin or one of his officials would step in. They would then do something to stop the scandal, and the share prices went up.
You believe Russia had a rule of men and not of law?
Well, so what happened was I was cheering as Putin was stepping in to help me, cheering Putin, cheering my own economic success. And then Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos.
Yes.
He arrests Michael Khodorkovsky, he puts him on trial, and he allows the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial, sitting in a cage. So imagine this. You're the 17th richest guy in Russia. You're on your yacht parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes. You walk out to the living room, you click your remote control, you switch on the CNN, and there you see a man far better than you, far richer, far smarter, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be?
Run.
Well, they couldn't run because they had all their stuff in Russia. They had to run back to Russia and stand in line to go to Vladimir Putin and say, Vladimir, what do I have to do to make sure I don't sit in a cage? And I wasn't there, so I can only speculate, but I believe that what he said was 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government, not 50% for the presidential administration.
Personally.
For Vladimir Putin.
Personally.